Talk Shoe.
Recorded live.
These are provisions, broadly and specifically with regards to infrastructure, that Republicans have traditionally supported broadly.
I suspect that one of the really big surges in the market for housing going forward is going to be the immigrant population.
But I don't, as a president, have the authority to go, if our national security is threatened, then you do it properly.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
This is how liberty dies. It's under the flow.
Welcome to Liberty Cap Talk Live. This is your host, Todd Andrew Barnett, and his co-host, James Landreth Jr. Hey, everybody, welcome to a very special episode of Liberty Cap Talk Live. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is a very special episode of the show that airs on Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In this special episode, we are, and by the way, this is broadcasting live, so if you have a question for our interview guest today, the number to call in is 724-444-7444. Once again, it's 724-444-7444. All you gotta do is basically just if it asks for a PIN number, all you gotta do is press 1 and then dial. You can put in your phone number, the area code, and your number, but it's not necessary. So if you have a question for our guest today, just please call into the show, and I encourage a lot of discussions. We're going to be talking quite a great deal about their new book that's just came out actually about a month ago, as a matter of fact. And, well, maybe actually a little over a month ago, but give or take. But it's a great book. I just want to preface this little opening here by saying that I've only read half of the book, and I'm still reading it. It's just like a very comprehensive book. It takes a while just to digest all this information. But so far, this is the most outstanding book I have ever read in my entire life on free markets and not capitalism. And this is a fantastic book all the way around. But we're going to get to our guests, who are the geniuses, the guys behind this little piece that they actually put together. It's actually a collection of essays that have been written over the years, and actually over a brief period of time, that is. And it's going to be a very quite interesting discussion, so let's get to it. He is a member of the Libertarian Party of California, as well as the National Party, if I'm not mistaken. He is a blogger at liberallaw.blogspot.com. He is also a professor at one of the top colleges in California. He's an economics professor. He's just an outstanding guy, probably one of the best libertarians in the movement. He's actually a market anarchist, and well, he's a very good friend of mine and has been on the show many times before when we were on Blog Talk Radio, and this is his first time on Talk Shoe. Please welcome our very good friend, Gary Chartier. Gary, you with us?
I sure am, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here.
No problem. And finally, our second interview guest, who is a co-author of their book together. And it's a splendid book. It's called Markets, Not Capitalism, Individualist Anarchism Against Bosses, Inequality, Corporate Power, and Structural Poverty. It was edited by Gary and his very good friend, who's also in the Liberty Movement. He's a very fantastic writer in the Liberty Movement. I've read a couple of his stuff in the book. Fantastic stuff from a left libertarian standpoint, and this will actually sock it to the likes of the people at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and the right libertarians. Please welcome our very good friend, Charles W. Johnson. Charles, you with us?
Hi, Todd. Yeah, thanks a lot.
No problem. I just want to basically start off by having you guys talk a little bit how you both came to libertarianism and evolved into left libertarianism for those on TalkShoe who are not aware of you, since LCTL just made the transition to TalkShoe about a couple months back. But since we only got about an hour long, so let's get to it. We'll start with you, Gary. How did you get into the movement, as brief as you possibly can?
Sure. So, I grew up with parents who were Goldwater Republicans. I was a science fiction reader. I programmed computers. I was, therefore, probably a fairly typical prospect for libertarianism among people of my generation. I took a long detour, starting sometime in college and continuing for some years after that into the statist left. I started as a libertarian, but was derailed largely because I couldn't see how libertarianism could deal successfully with problems of poverty and structural injustice. I was really re-radicalized by the Bush administration and the Obama administration during the 2000s. That brought me back to market anarchism. And as I discovered the work of people like Charles Johnson, Kevin Carson, and Roderick Long, I realized that the concerns that had drawn me to the statist left could be expressed in the libertarian framework that I was very passionately attached to at a kind of deep instinctive level. I realized, however, that I didn't have to be a statist to embrace those values. I could be a full-blown market anarchist and at the same time a leftist. There would be no problem in combining those two. It's been really stimulating to explore the implications of that realization with Charles and Kevin and Roderick and the others associated with the Center for a Stateless Society, and to draw on work beginning in the middle of the 19th century with Proudhon, continuing on to Benjamin Tucker, and all the way to the present in this great new book, Markets, Not Capitalism, that we really look forward to talking with you about.
Oh, that's fantastic. What about you, Charles?
Well, my story is fairly similar to Gary's in certain ways. I mean, I came to market anarchism, individualist anarchism, through the left, actually. So I started out sort of being interested in sort of progressive politics and third-party politics, basically because I was motivated by concerns about social justice, economic equality, and the social treatment of historically oppressed and marginalized groups, gay people, women, people of color, etc. And I first got really politically engaged when I was starting out in college, which would have been 1999 through 2000. So this is when Seattle was happening, when there was this big resurgence in the anarchist movement, and there was sort of no way you could get interested in the left, and especially in the radical left, which I got more and more interested in, without hearing a lot about anarchist ideas, sort of stateless solutions to social justice problems, and sort of the approach of direct action rather than political action, things like this. And so as I got more and more involved in the anarchist movement, I started getting especially interested in individualist anarchism and market anarchism as these historical traditions coming from some of the folks that Gary was talking about and that we talked about in our book, as sort of, I think, one of the best ways of articulating what I found especially attractive in the anarchist idea, in the idea of trying to address social problems, from a basis of sort of grassroots mutual aid and from a basis of individual liberty, rather than trying to address these things through the state and through political action. As I began to see more and more how the authoritarian relationships sort of pioneered and locked in by the state were in fact the causes of the very social problems that that I was so concerned with, and so how it was causing poverty and how it was causing all sorts of structural injustice. And so that's kind of the key thing that we're trying to get into in the book, is a discussion of how the aims that the left cares about are actually things that should lead one to the most radical forms of anti-statism.
Right. Well, to get into the book, which is a phenomenal book, by the way, and it goes into a lot of different areas of market anarchism through the essays that have been compiled and collected into one big volume here. Mm-hmm. And what I love about this book is its pure honesty and its pure exploration into anti-capitalism. What really annoys me to the greatest extent here is that you've got a number of Republicans, particularly the conservative stripe, or even some right libertarians of the Lew Rockwell variety, your garden variety, Lew Rockeweller, by the way, who basically says, well, we need capitalism. We need free market capitalism in order to solve the problem. You hear people like Judge Napolitano on his show Freedom Watch, who praises and lauds and hero worships and glorifies capitalism to the nth degree here. And exactly what is fundamentally wrong with the arguments that you hear with so many of the conservatives and a number of libertarians who take the free market capitalism route? Because you hear a lot of progressives who say, well, capitalism is the root of all evil. You've got Bill Maher, who said a while back on his show in his New Rules segment, we don't hate capitalism, we hate what's been done to it. So I guess my question is, well, exactly what is wrong with their arguments on capitalism? And exactly what exactly is probably the reason why we should stay away from the word capitalism. Sheldon Richman expounded on this. Mm-hmm. But for those who are not aware of it, what is fundamentally wrong with capitalism? Go ahead. We'll start with you, Gary.
Well, Charles is really on top of the history here, and I'd certainly like to hear from him as soon as possible. But I think the short version is that it's a distraction to think that this is just an argument about a word in the abstract. So it's not just the case that left libertarians and other sorts of left-wing market anarchists don't happen to like the individual word capitalism and instead have a kind of fetishistic attachment to the word, to the expression freed markets or something like that. The real issue here is that both in the minds of many, many ordinary people and really when the word is subjected to careful theoretical analysis, it's linked with a range of state-secured privileges and social inequalities that we have no burden to support.
go ahead, Charles. You were going to say something. I know it.
Sure. Well, so I mean, just as and it's similar to what Gary was saying. I think that the thing that we really want to call attention to in this book is I mean, there's sort of this rhetorical question, like, what should libertarians call what we're into? Should we call it capitalism, or should we call it free markets, or something like that? And that's an interesting discussion. But when you hear from conservatives the constant refrain about promoting capitalism, promoting private enterprise, and sort of seeing these as the economic saviors of the crisis that we're currently in, or sort of as key to a decent living condition for anybody. There's sort of two things that you have to pull apart there, right? They're making a claim about free markets, and they're making a claim about capitalism that is about business as it's currently practiced. And they want to talk about it as if we had a free market capitalist system. You hear that over and over again, like our private enterprise system. And it's relatively clear that the system that we have is a system that has a lot of capitalists. It's not clear that it's a system that has a lot of free markets. So the concern is that the practices that businesses ordinarily engage in, sort of especially big businesses like the Fortune 500, the top of the banking industry, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, people like this.
Right.
The big 800-pound gorillas in the economic sphere, that these large companies engage in all kinds of business practices which are frequently criticized by the left, and which have sort of, both for the practices themselves and the kind of projects they invest in the third world, the way that they depend on sort of constant infusions of government cash, and the way that they treat creditors in the United States, but also that have sort of larger structural effects that create sort of extreme inequalities of wealth, for example, that sort of put ordinary working people in a really disadvantaged position as far as just sort of the basics of controlling their own lives and owning the things that their livelihoods depend on. That this kind of business model and the social ripple effects from sort of the market being dominated by businesses with this business model. The basic claim when Republicans keep saying free market capitalism over and over again is that kind of business model is the result of a free market. And the left libertarian view is that sort of these extreme concentrations of wealth and suppression of competition and sort of the structural poverty that makes people sort of artificially desperate for jobs from sort of a corporate employer, for example, that these are all actually effects of the bailout state, the effects of sort of monopolistic restrictions imposed by the state. And so, as Gary was saying, that we as libertarians have no obligation to stand up for the best, stand up for the interests of giant corporations. Those giant corporations and their interests, are certainly capitalistic in the sense of being, corporate in the sense of being sort of premised on the ideal of big business. But they have nothing to do with free markets. They derive from state privilege, not from free exchange between individual people.
Right. There's probably one of the most interesting pieces you wrote in your book, Gary. You were talking about, probably in one article you wrote a year ago, or actually not that you wrote a year ago, called "Advocates of Free Markets Should Oppose Capitalism." And, you wrote down 3 distinguishable senses of capitalism. Capitalism, 1, an economic system that features personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services. Capitalism, 2, an economic system that features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government. Capitalism, 3, rule of workplaces, society, and if there is one, the state, by capitalists, and that's in italicized, that is by a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production.
And you know, Todd, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that that's really, in fact, an incomplete list. So in one of his recent essays on this topic, Charles has emphasized a 4th meaning, which is simply commercialized society in which everything is organized around the cash nexus and commercial exchange. And I'd also suggest that there's a 5th meaning, which we sometimes encounter and which Charles's comment certainly alluded to, which is roughly whatever the economic system we now have is. So it just becomes a label for whatever it is we've got right now.
Right.
You know, it's the biggest problem that the term capitalism, which I think this is a very big problem with the political economic system that we have right now. Sheldon Richman, a very good friend of ours in the movement, recently wrote a piece on this when the ballot started back in 2008, in which and I'm just, paraphrasing here, he basically termed capitalism as, a political economic system pretty much involving profits are private, but the losses are socialized. and to the extent, like, for example, the big banks, when we saw what was going on with AIG, with Bear Stearns, with the bankruptcies of Lehman Brothers, what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were doing with regards to the housing bubble, all this collusive, plutocratic, autocratic government that we have. And basically, I find that right now our current political economic system is more of a mishmash of not just big business and the state, but big business pretty much owning the state, pretty much governing the state and telling the state, this is what we need because we're the elitists, we're the ones that have all these privileges that are being doled out to us. The banking lobby tells the government, we want these rules, and if you don't, we'll actually kick you out of office and we'll put somebody else in there if we have to. And the bureaucrats seem to play along, and at the end of the day, when all is said and done, these industries get their way one way or the other.
Todd, I think that's really, really getting at something that's crucial. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that political actors, political elites, don't sometimes have their own agendas that are separate from those of economic elites, but I think it is absolutely obvious that the economic elites play a vital role in shaping the political process. A number of us have seen some just sort of marvelous kind of, sort of Venn diagrams in the last few weeks that highlight the overlap between current or past leadership groups in 3 corporations, General Electric, Monsanto, and Goldman Sachs, and the highest reaches of the executive branch of the U.S. government. And in each case, there is a really dramatic overlap, so that current or former executives of these corporations now are playing crucial roles in the government. There's similar evidence that Goldman has exhibited real enthusiasm for placing its alums at the heads of central banks in Europe, where it's obviously in a position to play a vital role in shaping the economies of the various European Union countries. So I think you're really right to say that there's a dramatic overlap
between the corporate elite and the political elite. And one of the things that we really want to highlight in this book is the myth, the fact that it is a myth to suppose that somehow the interests of big business and the economic elites, in the financial sector on the one hand, and the interests of politicians on the other are dramatically opposed. Again, there are various factions within both political and economic elites. They're up to different things sometimes, but their relationship is much more collusive and cooperative than it is in any real sense confrontational. There's confrontation for the cameras, but behind the scenes, it's quite clear that their interests are aligned and their activities are very much aligned as well.
I mean, in the anti-war movement, when especially in sort of the run-up to Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, it was pretty common to point out that, in spite of the surface-level arguments that you had between Democrats and Republicans, for example, that there really was only one party in power, the War Party, right? The War Party is sort of acts as one party on foreign policy because they sort of claim to disagree with each other, but the continuance of American empire and the continuance of sort of interventionist foreign policy is completely behind the lines. It's part of the Beltway consensus that you can't sort of significant, that neither party is interested in significantly disrupting. And it's going to be the same way with the kinds of economic privilege that we're talking about. That, again, there aren't two parties. There's one party. It's the bank party. And, the basic premise that the state needs to be involved in maintaining all the key structural features of corporate capitalism, no matter how many tax subsidies it costs, no matter how much, no matter how much in the way of government development programs and government monopolies and so forth that it takes, that the socioeconomic system that we have now and its basic features, the wage labor economy and the dominance of finance and so forth, that it should be an aim of explicit government policy to protect that, regardless of which party is in power.
Well, there's an old phrase that drives this entire axiom home completely, and I think it's very appropriate to mention this because this is the heart of this so-called for what it is, a corporatocracy, if you will, and which is what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. We see it all the time. This is part and parcel of why the Occupy movement was speaking out against Wall Street, against what the bailouts were happening in 2008. There's an old phrase. It sort of goes along the lines of, he who controls others finds himself controlled as well. Same thing in business. And business will find itself, if they try to control the state, then the state's going to control that business too. I mean, there is some sort of a collusive, a very dynamic collusive relationship, but at the same time, these regulations that these organizations actually go to, say, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the lawmakers on Capitol Hill, it's used to basically quash real economic competition between a real free market in the grand sense. Small companies, very small businesses that really want to compete, and they're not interested in the handouts. They just want to provide goods and services. And the big players that have been getting the handouts and, acting as though they're actually trying to satisfy their customers and whatnot, they're basically rolling over them and topping them over and just demolishing them over. And they have a competitive and economic and political advantage over these players. So,
Todd, when you say that, I'm reminded of the former president of Archer Daniels Midland, Dwayne Andreas, who famously observed that the competitor, in quotes, is our friend and the customer is our enemy. Why? Because the customer, of course, the customer demands lower prices. The customer demands higher quality. The competitor, by contrast, shares with us the desire to boost profits at the customer's expense. And so what we've seen, it's not just a recent development. It's a development that, has been charted in great detail in U.S. history, certainly beginning in the post-Civil War period. I'm sure it predates that quite dramatically. But if you think about the ways in which the famous New Left historian Gabriel Kalko documented the role of Gilded Age capitalists in seeking to suppress competition through federal regulation, the way in which a guy like Theodore Roosevelt, despite his high profile as a, quote, trust buster, was really somebody who believed that appropriately, quote, liberal corporate capitalism was exactly what we needed. The ways in which, in the wake of the First World War, folks like Gerard Swope of GE, a little earlier, Elbert Gary of U.S. Steel, worked hard to reduce competition. They used rhetoric to defend their approach that suggested that somehow the public was being harmed by, quote, cutthroat competition, but in fact their real goal was to safeguard their own profits at the expense of the public. So this is really a very common thread in American history.
You were going to say something, Charles. I'm sorry.
Oh no! I mean, I was mostly going to underline what Gary was saying. That one of the things about Kolko's work and similar work that's very useful, I think, is the way that they discuss the way that he discusses essentially how the birth of the alphabet soup agencies in Washington. You start getting all of these regulatory boards that were sold to the public as supposedly a means to try and restrain the worst practices of the corporate elite and of the robber barons. That actually, if you look at the way that things like the Railroad Commission worked, and also who was sponsoring them and who was pushing them forward on the legislative agenda, that these are very clearly, they exercise control in a certain sense, but it's control that's aimed at a particular end, which is that these essentially serve as the dispute resolution board for industrial cartels. And so the idea was to provide an enforcement mechanism so that the members of the railroad cartel, for example, can all keep their prices ratcheted up. This was one of the big things that kept coming up over and over again in the papers and the industry newsletters and so forth, was the terrible fear of falling railroad prices. And so to keep competitors from playing off of each other in a way that would actually ultimately benefit consumers and ultimately benefit workers, instead they had the state come in and develop an enforcement mechanism for their cartel so that they could keep prices permanently ratcheted up and upstart competitors permanently locked out of the market.
Right. There's a very interesting article that you highlighted to Sheldon probably about a week ago, Gary, called The Market as the Antidote to Capitalism, from the Rational Optimist. And there was one paragraph, I think it was the intro paragraph, that caught my eye, which I thought was probably brought this point close to home. And even the final paragraph. The first paragraph says, the market, when allowed to flourish, tears apart monopoly and generates freedom and fairness better than any other human institution. Today's private sector, by contrast, is increasingly dominated by companies that are privileged by government through cozy contract, soft subsidy, convenient regulation, and crony conversation. That is why it's producing such unfair outcomes. And then you highlighted at the end, Gary, and you put this in quotes as a hat tip to him, capitalism represents the interests of the rich, whereas the market represents the interests of the poor. That's here for the market as an antidote to capitalism. I thought that was probably the most astute observation and for a piece that basically tears apart what conservatives have been saying for years about their much beloved so-called economic system that they favor that is actually working against the poor. It's funny because both the Republicans and Democrats are pro-capitalistic in the sense that they are using the system against the poor and hurting, a real market full that would be producing goods and services. Mm-hmm. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, absolutely.
How about
Gary?
Gary.
Structural poverty that results from law and regulation. Structural poverty can clearly be rooted in, can clearly be attributed to the action of the state. And Charles, in what I think is one of the most moving and insightful pieces in the book, scratching by how government creates poverty as we know it, Charles talks about the ways in which a whole myriad of government regulations interact with, mutually reinforce each other in their effect of undermining people's economic independence and making it very difficult for people to avoid, either grinding poverty or degrading wage labor. And I think it's really a powerful piece, and it captures, I think, the point that you're getting at very nicely. Privilege is the enemy of the poor. That sounds obvious, but it's important to spell out exactly what is meant by that. That by privileging certain ways of doing business, by privileging certain kinds of economic interests, those without power and influence are excluded and denied the opportunities they would have in a genuinely freed market. Now, that piece by Matt Ridley that you highlighted, I think, says that in a very passionate and powerful way. Matt is more a libertarian than not, though he's certainly not an anarchist. And he doesn't perhaps go in quite the direction that we would at some point, for instance, in talking about the need for more regulation in a context in which, in reality, privilege
which he did in his article, by the way.
Yeah. So privilege served to prop up the elites, even in the context in which he talks about the need for more regulation, and privilege really just needed to be removed rather than supplemented with additional regulation. So, I differ with him at that point, but I think it was a great piece in its general thrust, insofar as it highlighted the vast gap between a genuinely liberated, a freed market on the one hand, and a market distorted by elite privilege on the other.
Right. What I find particularly interesting is, which is something that you, Charles, and I have mentioned this before, but also Sheldon have mentioned terms like privileges and guarantees. What kind of privileges and guarantees can one expect to find in this corporatocracy, this mishmash that we've been discussing all along?
Sure. Well, there's sort of a couple major areas that I want to talk about. One of them is the direct privileges and guarantees that are granted to big business, and the other is the indirect privileges and guarantees, which are indirect because they don't have to do with sort of handing things directly to the business, but rather they have to do with government measures that suppress their competitors, that sort of put their workers in an artificially desperate situation, which sort of helps crush their employees' bargaining power and gets them a much better deal labor costs and so on. And so in terms of the direct privileges in guarantees, there's some big obvious stuff. If you read the news lately, it's hard to miss privileges and guarantees. And they just announced that it took $7.7 trillion in Federal Reserve bailout loans to help keep the banking system running, for example. Right. Or you can point to the TARP bailouts and so on. But so that's huge, right? I mean, we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars here. It dwarfs almost any other government program that libertarians could possibly talk about. But in addition to that, you have government sort of constantly engaging in that kind of corporate welfare, also constantly engaging in the creation of rigged markets, and markets which are designed so that people are forced into them and forced into them on particular sorts of terms. And so, like, one of the best examples of this is the recent, much touted great progressive victory of our left-wing radical president Barack Obama. When
I know where you're going with this. The entire Solyndra scandal, which is basically locked. Yeah.
Actually, yeah. Well, so there is that. There's the use of sort of research and development funds, and there's a large number of corporations that depend very largely on direct government contracts or government R&D handouts. There's Solyndra, of course. There's been tons of money going to the big three automakers under this heading as well to subsidize their R&D into higher gas mileage cars. And so on. Actually, what I was going to say was the healthcare bill. Right? Oh
yeah.
So the big progressive triumph of Barack Obama's presidency, as it's going to be touted, is the fact that everyone in America will now be forced to pay for corporate health insurance. And if individual people don't have enough money to pay for the mandate, then the government will subsidize the bill to the insurance companies. And I mean, this is a huge windfall for the corporate insurance market, and it sort of represents a case in which sort of first government creates a problem by driving medical costs through the roof, and we could talk about a number of ways that they do that through the patent system and through the FDA and so on. And so they make it effectively impossible to pay your medical bills unless you have health insurance. And then, if that as if that weren't enough, they come in and they then mandate that you have to buy health insurance from this government-approved list of corporate providers. And so this is essentially conjuring a vast sort of cash nexus for things out of thin air through the use of government force. It's sort of shooting prices through the roof and then propping up a multi-billion or multi-trillion-dollar market to try and handle those catastrophic costs that the earlier interventions created. So there's that. There's rigged markets. In a similar vein, there's a number of government monopolies that sort of much of the Fortune 500 depends on, such as intellectual property monopolies in the form of patents and copyrights. This is essentially that is the business model of Microsoft, of GlaxoSmithKline and Roche and the major pharmaceutical corporations, of General Electric is sort of just a large legally recognized patent portfolio, and so on. That the basics of their business model is to grab and then exploit to the hilt a set of government-granted monopolies. So there's that. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, too, that there's also this big problem that you've got people like Walter Block and Jacob Hubert at the Mises Institute defending corporations and whatnot. One of the biggest things I've noticed here, and I believe it was Brad Edmonds who basically said on the Mises blog, not the Mises blog, but at Mises.org, basically, well, we need limited liability laws. We need to, put that on the shareholders and not on the owners of the business. The liability belongs to the shareholders, not to the owners of the business. And and also corporations are a great thing. They're not a creature of the state. They're a creature of the free market. And a lot of people aren't buying this. I mean, and this is the problem with some of the right libertarian rhetoric, because they ignore the privileges and guarantees and all the nice little goodies and perks that come with the package. They even, when it suits their interests, they'll support, probably to a very relatively minor extent, maybe some protectionism or some mercantilism. And protectionism and mercantilism are hallmarks of a plutocracy by itself. So it's this is the big problem here that they never address. This is why Kevin Carson does a brilliant job referring to them as vulgar libertarians. One second they act like they're libertarians, and the next minute they act like economic status. They can't really make up their minds one way or the other.
So I think to be fair, perhaps to some of our conversation partners elsewhere, Kevin really does try to emphasize that he's talking about a tendency within people's thought and discourse, a tendency that we can call vulgar libertarianism. And I think Kevin tries to be pretty careful about not referring to any person as a, quote, vulgar libertarian, because the reality is that all of us are complex, and we all do find ourselves tugged in different directions, sometimes by different circumstances. So I think, having said that, it does certainly seem as if some people are too often tempted to be, at least I would say, overly sanguine about the gap between what we could expect in a genuinely free market and what we've got now. That is, I think there's a tendency to underestimate sometimes the impact of state-secured privilege on the business models of particular organizations and on their wealth levels. And I think it's really crucial that when we reflect on why we believe a society rooted in peaceful, voluntary cooperation, and that's the mantra I keep wanting to underscore. That kind of society, when we stress why that kind of society is important, I believe it's absolutely vital that we underscore how different such a society would be from one that's dominated by the Fortune 500. And
I agree.
Especially by the financial elite. So I understand you agree. I'm just stressing the kind of point I'd want to make. It's not so much, I think, that I'm looking for an opportunity to bash anybody. Jacob Hubert, I think, is a great guy. Walter's very helpfully contributed to a symposium that I'm editing, and I think that they're people who really do care about state power. But I also think at the same time that it's tempting for people who don't like anti-market rhetoric to think that somehow anti-big business rhetoric is at the same time anti-market rhetoric. And I think that's something we have to help the wider libertarian movement to move away from, just as we also have to help people who are tempted to embrace the statist left to realize that it's not their friend. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is and even, I remember people like from the Cato Institute, like Jerry Taylor from the Cato Institute, for instance, made this one point. And I think he made this point some years ago on some cable news network, or maybe it was on some sort of op-ed he wrote for Cato at the time. in which he said, "Well, we're pro free market, not pro business."
Right.
And he made that distinction quite clearly. I mean, you can be in favor of free markets, but you're not necessarily in favor of business, because business can actually use the government to regulate and even quash the market. You can be in favor of business and not necessarily in favor of free markets, because, well, you want the controls and the subsidies. Subsidies are a big thing, a big attractive feature that comes with the package deal, one way or the other. So I think that is a very important point that needs to be addressed, because I think that tends to be sidelined a lot in most of the libertarian anarchistic conversations that are doled out on a consistent day-to-day basis. But there is one point here when the article I pointed out that you hat tipped to Sheldon, Gary. I was talking to this one gal who commented on the article by Matt, and she goes, "The market is founded on capitalism. Without capitalism, what is for the market to do?"
Okay.
And then she writes, "What is capitalism to me? In its purest and most unadulterated form, it is quite simply the practice of using capital to finance the operation of a business. Whether that means investors buy equipment and raw materials, or I save up that money and capitalize my own endeavor, the object and goal of capitalism is to put other people to work and generate a profit for investors, whether that's a bank, a group of individuals, or myself. Anything that goes beyond that may or may not actually be a part and parcel of capitalism. But this is my definition. I believe that it requires no further embellishment to be succinctly accurate and valid."
Okay.
Any comments to that, Charles?
Yeah, well, so if I mean, words can be used lots of
on Facebook, just so you know. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, words can be used lots of ways, and if you want to use the word capitalism just to mean something like the existence and use of capital goods, then I'm not against that. But I don't know. Well, I do know people who would be against that, but I don't know of anyone outside of the primitivist scene who's against that. I mean, an anti-capitalist like Proudhon, or like Marx for that matter, is not against the use of capital goods. The question has to do with sort of how capital goods will be put to use and who will own them. And the other sense, one of the other senses of the term capitalism, the one that we're dealing with in this book when we make a distinction between markets on the one hand and capitalism on the other, is not just the ownership of capital or the accumulation of capital, but the concentration of capital in a relatively few hands, and the use of that concentration to exert domination over economic life and over social life. And so, the question has to do with sort of what's your basic picture of what capital ownership and what capital use is going to look like. If that's going to look more or less like, sort of business as usual, as we're familiar with it, with sort of, capitalist employers and financiers going on and doing more or less what they do in our current society. Or whether the model that you have in mind is something more like individuals owning the tools of their own labor, or workers' co-ops owning their own shops, or sort of a whole range of more mutualistic, more horizontal sort of options where people have sort of a very direct and very autonomous, sort of a very direct relationship with a great deal of personal autonomy when it comes to the capital resources that they depend on for their own livelihood. And so, that's what we're coming at. That's what we're trying to look at is the extent to which a market economy can be an economy which doesn't have sort of these big class monopolies in sort of ownership and effective control over the means of production, over people's homes and their tools and their lands and their shops. And so if you want to call that a version of capitalism, I don't really care too much about the names that people use. I'm interested in the underlying facts. But I think that is something that's very different from the kind of business model that you see in large capitalist employers and financiers today. And so that's sort of what we're generally pushing as the central issue here.
Right. Well, she actually says that this is a matter of semantics, but I think that to a very significant degree, the semantics do matter, and at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about that a bit in the long lead piece that I have, Markets Freed from Capitalism. So I mean, as I said, I care sort of more about underlying facts than I care about the labels that are used to describe it. But labels can have some effects, and one of the effects they have is sort of what the typical examples you would imagine are, I guess. So when we talk about free markets predominantly in terms of the activities of capitalists and predominantly in terms of the activities of business and so on, rather than talking about them in terms of sort of small-scale individual hustles, or in terms of worker, sort of the actions of workers trying to make a livelihood for themselves. We get this model of what free markets mean that basically just means free reign for business as usual. Basically what you've got at McDonald's and Walmart and McDonald's and Walmart and AT&T and Chase Manhattan, except like more of it, even freer, so they can just do whatever they want. I'm sorry.
Isn't it fair to say that agorism would count as a division of free markets, as a part of the free market model, operating outside the sphere of the so-called private sector, which is a regulated sector by itself? There is, I think that would be a very, very I think that's a very, very appropriate, and not to mention a paramount distinction between free markets, which is what you, Gary, and I advocate, and what is being peddled as free markets, because markets are not free, they're regulated. So therefore the word free market has pretty much been sullied and vilified.
Yeah.
Well, sure.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
Oh, I think that the model of the agora that agorists are talking about is one that's in a lot of ways sympathetic to the alternate kind of example, the alternate kind of sort of illustration of what free market activity is all about that we're trying to promote. These sort of less vertical, non-capitalistic kinds of alternatives that are based much more on sort of human-scale social interaction and individual actors and sort of workers working together, rather than being obsessed with CEOs and employers and sort of the conventional capitalist market that we're familiar with. So, I mean, in that sense, a number of the contributors to the book would identify themselves as agorists, Brad Spangler especially, of course. And there's a reason why there are these connections between like what the agorists are doing and what sort of mutualists and other free market anti-capitalists are doing.
You were going to say something, Gary.
No, I think Charles covered the bases nicely.
Okay. I wanted to direct your attention to several more questions I have, and then we'll wrap this up. But I think one important point that I want to bring up is number one, something that Newt Gingrich said to Ron during the debate.
Sorry, there's an important point that was made by Newt Gingrich. I'm confused.
Well, this is a point that, it's not a really important point, but something I found hilarious, something I found ridiculous, and I think you'll notice it because Ron Paul pretty much creamed him on the Freddie Mac issue in last week's debates. Check this out.
But I want to bring Congressman Paul in on this because, Congressman, you've been running ads that are quite tough. Quite tough on Speaker Gingrich here in Iowa this week, accusing him of, quote, and this is a quote from your ad, serial hypocrisy. Why do you think Speaker Gingrich is a hypocrite?
Well, he's been on different positions, on so many issues, single payer. He's taken some positions that are not conservative. He supported the TARP funds. And the other thing that really should have annoyed a lot of people, he received a lot of money from Freddie Mac. Now, Freddie Mac is essentially a government organization. While he was earning a lot of money from Freddie Mac, I was fighting over a decade to try to explain to people where the housing bubble was coming from. So Freddie Mac is bailed out by the taxpayers. So in a way, Newt, I think you probably got some of our taxpayers' money. They got taxes, they got money out, and they're still getting bailed out. But you were a spokesman for them, and you received money for them. So I think this is something that the people ought to know about. But there's been many positions, and you have admitted many of the positions where you have changed positions, but if you were looking for a consistent position, I think there's be a little bit of trouble anybody competing with me on consistency.
Well, first of all, as you say normally in your own speeches, the housing bubble came from the Federal Reserve inflating the money supply. Now, that's the core of the housing bubble. And I happen to be with you on auditing the Fed and frankly on firing Bernanke. Second, I was never a spokesman for any agency. I never did any lobbying for any agency. I offered strategic advice. I was in the private sector, and I was doing things in the private sector. And when you're in the private sector and you have a company and you offer advice, like McKinsey does, like a bunch of other companies do, you're allowed to charge money for it. That's called free enterprise.
It's the taxpayers' money, though. We had to bail these people out.
Well, I'm not for bailing them out. In fact,
okay. He called it free enterprise, Gary Charles. What do you say to that?
I guess I just remind folks that the language of freedom is pretty infinitely elastic. Freedom's like motherhood and apple pie. Nobody's against. So therefore, people are always going to find ways of talking about whatever they're for as some instance of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, when Newt talks about being in the private sector, I guess there's two senses of being in the private sector that you might be interested in. There's whether the organization that you're working for is privately funded, and then there's whether the organization that you're working for is privately controlled. And Freddie Mac is an institution that has ties with the government, but you could basically think of its management as much like the management of a private company. But of course, where does all its funding come from? Well, all that funding comes from taxpayer pockets, and so there are a lot of companies when conservatives start promoting things like start promoting what they call privatization. In general, you see this over and over again that you're talking about sort of private management, but not private, but social funding, or coerced funding from government. And so, if he wants to say that he's in the private sector, he can say that, but that doesn't erase the fact that that's a part of the private sector that's being that the rest of us are forced to fund.
What's really interesting, too, is another subject that I find particularly interesting. I was talking to Sharon Presley, and this goes into an area in the book that you guys talk about, which is intellectual property laws, which is a part of the corporatocracy that you guys mention in the book, which is intellectual property. The idea that you have to have copyright, you got to have licensing, you got to have trademarks, you've got to have all of these artificial mechanisms in order to protect your work. And Stephen Kinsella of LouRockwell.com and the Mises Institute pretty much does an excellent job, taking a sledgehammer, or more importantly, a pickaxe, and just pick away at this whole concept of intellectual property. And one libertarian I was talking to a couple of nights ago was Sharon Presley, a libertarian feminist who believes in the concept of copyrights. Artists and composers and authors should be paid, and their work should be protected, and and they should be asking for other people's permission to use their work, and yada yada yada. What would you say to somebody like her, and also, does she have a point?
Well, look, Sharon's a great person, and I'm very fond of her, and I certainly don't want to turn this into an opportunity to bash her any more than I'd want to bash Jacob Hubert. But I guess what I would say is that, if you say in the abstract people ought to be paid for their work, well, I mean, imagine that you're talking not about the kinds of issues that prompt discussions of copyright and patent, but suppose you're talking about some other kind of work. Suppose you're talking about teachers. Suppose you're talking about plumbers. And somebody says, teachers and plumbers ought to be paid for their work. And so, of course, I'm going to respond, yes, indeed they should. So how much should they be paid? And it seems to me the only way to know that is to figure out what emerges from a genuinely free and fair negotiations between the plumber or the teacher on the one hand, either individually or as part of a union or whatever, part of a co-op on the one hand, and whoever is going to be paying on the other. So if I say I made a movie and I should be paid for my work, does that mean that I get to decide in advance how much somebody else is going to pay me, that I get to decide that such and such is a fair amount and that and only that is going to be paid me, and I can extract that wealth from others? Well, presumably not. Presumably my work has to be compensated in light of what people are actually prepared to pay me. I think the pro-copyright folks, it seems to me, want to say that copyright holders get to tell you how to use your own property in light of what they, with monopoly privileges, are able to extract from you by way of profits. And that's very different from what I think we normally mean when we say that people ought to be paid for their work.
Right. Final thought on this, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree with Gary. The key issue here is not whether or not artists and other creative workers deserve to be paid for their work. Obviously, they do. The question is how much and by what means. And I think that a system of copy monopolies, which is what these rights essentially boil down to. They block other people from peacefully imitating or duplicating what's been done, is the wrong means for going about solving this problem. And the right means to go about it is essentially by trying to develop alternative business models that aren't based on selling paper or selling discs.
Right.
Todd, if I can just follow up on that. Kevin Carson, in talking about these matters, uses a great analogy, and he's drawing on the work of a pro-copyright libertarian, Tibor Machin, who talks in a very different context about the use of eminent domain to get land for airports. And Tibor notes that there are folks who say, in effect, well, we've got to use eminent domain and subsidies and so forth, because otherwise we wouldn't get the airports we have now. And Tibor's response, in effect, is, yeah, well, so what? If the only way you can get something is through the use of aggression, then perhaps it's something you ought not to have. If this isn't really what emerges from a genuinely free market process, why should we assume that it's the right thing to have? And I mention that example because I think that so many of the discussions of patent and copyright begin with the judgment that somehow the current state of the pharmaceutical industry or the movie industry or whatever, that these are optimal from whatever social or economic perspective there might be. And so the question is, can you replicate the existing state of the market without the monopolistic privileges that shape that market?
Right.
And my response is, I don't have to show that. What I have to show is that we have an unfairly, aggressively misshapen market, and let's see what a free market produces, a genuinely free market produces. I don't have to show that such a market would produce exactly the industry we have now, and indeed I hope it wouldn't.
Well, for an addendum to that, to put a finer point to that, back in Shakespeare's day, before copyrights are invented, artists, composers, poets, authors, essayists, you name it, basically, and even playwrights, they profited from their work, but their works were never copyrighted, and they made a killing off of their works. They made a substantial amount of money, including painters, Leonardo da Vinci. Made work by selling his paintings and whatnot. Look at, can you imagine if, I think it was one point that was made in the book, which was, imagine Sir Isaac Newton if he had, say, copyright control over, the laws of gravity. Would somebody have to pay him a specific fee every single time they mentioned it or used it in a work? And by the way, who would have time to go and ask for permission? What if the artist is unreachable? Do you really have time to really ask for permission to use that? And then,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's actually a major significant issue in the publishing industry today, is there are a number of orphaned works where it's difficult or simply impossible to locate copyright holders, but because of the way that copyright has been extended over at the behest of the Disney Corporation, there's now a pretty substantial number of works that just can't be reprinted by anybody because nobody can contact the people who the law says that they have to contact.
And they no longer own the copyrights to those anyway. The corporation does.
Yeah.
So that's the big thing. I mean, you can't even reprint the old story of Pinocchio because Disney owns the entire right to that entire story in its full extent. So it's impossible. One final question I have here is, exactly what do you hope this book will, what do you hope that the person who reads your book will take away from it? Do you think he will have a better understanding of what free markets are all about, as opposed to the language of capitalism as conservatives and even the Mises crowd have been using for a number of years, including Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand, who have tried to use capitalism but pretty much attach that baggage to the libertarian movement?
Well, I guess I hope they'll come away with a recognition that genuinely freed markets, liberated markets, can be liberating, can be sources of energy and dynamism in a society that offers infinite freedom to experiment, to be creative, to explore alternate ways of being human and being free. Peaceful, voluntary cooperation is exciting, and I hope that prejudices that people might have against peaceful voluntary cooperation, either prejudices from the right, no, we really need social hierarchy, prejudices from the left, no, the state is absolutely essential to protect us from social hierarchy, but those prejudices can be transcended, and that people will see that a peaceful voluntary society is both possible and attractive.
Charles?
Yeah, I mean, much the same as Gary. What I'd really hope people come away from this with is sort of a better sense of the radical possibilities of freed markets. And so, I mean, if let's say you divide up the readers into about the possible readers into about three groups. Well, you have anti-libertarian leftists on the one hand, people who come to this being very seriously concerned with issues of social justice and of socioeconomic equality, and a better life for women and people of color, LGBT people, and so on. I hope that they come away from this book with a better sense of the radical possibilities for achieving those goals through libertarian means. That it doesn't take the state, that all these things are absolutely worth caring about, that it's absolutely worth caring about the environment and about people's standard of living, but that you don't need the state to get that, and that in fact the best way to get that is through grassroots direct action. People who sort of come from a more right libertarian perspective, I hope will come away from this book sort of essentially seeing the ways that the principles they say they're committed to, these free market principles, aren't in conflict with a serious concern about socioeconomic equality and about ecological sustainability and so on. That if freed markets are what's really important to them, then it also ought to be important to them to move away from sort of these models that are based on capitalistic business as usual.
Right.
And people who already came to this with sort of broadly less libertarian sympathies, I hope that they'll feel like they're coming home to a certain extent, that there's this fascinating historical tradition going back to Proudhon and back past Proudhon to all these free market, pro-equality, anti-capitalist radicals, from Proudhon and Tucker to Clare, to Victor Yaros, and with all these fascinating tendencies that have been going on in the contemporary scene, and sort of see that there's there's a broad and rich and vigorous tradition which has much too little talked about these days, and that I think we can get a lot of benefit from connecting up with and drawing from and learning more about.
Awesome. Thank you guys for coming on the show tonight. Today. This has been a lively discussion. We have to end it here. But Gary, Charles, this has been the most enlightening discussion on your book, Markets Not Capitalism, Individualist Anarchism Against Bosses, Inequality, Corporate Power, and Structural Poverty. Thank you so much, guys, and good luck with the book. I hope it becomes a bestseller. Maybe I hope it becomes a New York Times bestseller, but I doubt it.
Let's hope.
Yeah, let's hope.
Hey,
take it
Todd,
easy, guys.
Todd, thanks so much for having us on, and thanks so much to Charles for making this a great project.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot, guys.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
And that's it. And I believe that's my cue to end the show here. See you guys tomorrow night, same place. Jim will be hosting the show. See ya. Bye now.